Hello my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today I'm talking about one of the real-life inspirations for the eerie retro Netflix series Stranger Things, a secret and incredibly inhumane government experiment called Project MK Ultra. So if you're ready to lose any trust you may have had in government agencies, keep watching. Stranger Things is a popular Netflix series that recently finished its 4th season. In the series, which is set in the 1980s, a group of teenagers in the small town of Hawkins, Indiana, frequently find themselves solving eerie mysteries, contending with alternate dimensions, and battling monsters. I'll try to avoid including Stranger Things spoilers in this video. I'll just quickly touch on how Project MK Ultra factors into the show. In the series, there's a character named Eleven, played by Millie Bobby Brown, who displays unusual psychokinetic and telepathic abilities, and has spent her childhood undergoing a series of experiments at a really suspicious and secretive facility. In Season 1, and this could be considered a spoiler, though I'll keep it vague, it's revealed that Eleven's powers have been inherited from a biological parent, who had been a test subject for Project MK Ultra. It seems that the residual effects of these experiments have enabled Eleven to make contact with alternate dimensions, which is pretty much what the entire show is based on. That and a ton of 80s nostalgia. According to the series creators, Matt and Ross Duffer, also known as the Duffer Brothers, the show definitely takes inspiration from Project MK Ultra. In an interview with Rolling Stone, they stated, "We wanted the supernatural element to be grounded in science in some way." So what exactly was Project MK Ultra? MK Ultra was a series of experiments conducted by the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, between the 1950s and the 1970s. This involved the very covert use of physical and mental torture, Nazi collaboration, and psychedelic drugs. The goal of Project MK Ultra was to develop mind control techniques, supposedly to help America beat the Soviets during the Cold War. At this time, the CIA was convinced that the Soviets had developed a drug or technique that would allow them to control human minds. So of course, they wanted to dabble in mind control too. As you know from previous videos, so much of modern American history and many of our beliefs and attitudes today have been shaped by the Cold War, which was a period of immense tension between the US and the Soviet Union and their allies. This lasted from around 1947 to 1991. It was basically a really competitive geopolitical, ideological, and economical rivalry that featured a rather terrifying nuclear arms race that left everyone paranoid about the possibility of an atomic bomb being dropped at any moment. It's mind-blowing how much this period of history has shaped us as a society, and I've barely scraped the surface on this channel. Cold War tensions were escalated by the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. This was the first time the US and Soviet Union, both considered global superpowers, had fought a proxy war in a third country. I'll try not to go too deep into this topic, but explaining a little bit about why the US got involved in the Korean War will be helpful in understanding the mindset of the time and how Project MK Ultra came to be. I promise this is all relevant. In the decade following World War II, communism began to spread in the Far East. During this time, the US had developed a domino theory, speculating that if one country adopted communism, then communist ideologies would quickly spread to neighboring countries. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel into the Soviet-supported Communist North Korea and the non-communist, American-backed South Korea. When North Korea launched an attack on South Korea in June of 1950 with the support of China and the Soviet Union, the U.S. joined the fray on the side of South Korea. This established a precedent of the U.S. being involved in events in Asia, and greatly heightened Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union and its allies. Even after the fighting of the Korean War had stopped, American soldiers still remained stationed in South Korea, adding more pressure to the already strained relations between countries. The U.S. seemed to view communism as a threat to democracy, and as something contagious that needed to be stopped before it infected the entire planet. In April of 1953, as the Korean War was coming to an end and Cold War paranoia was really ramping up, the New York Times published an article stating that American prisoners of war returning from Korea may have been, quote, converted by communist brainwashers. This assumption was based on the confessions of some American soldiers that they'd committed war crimes, particularly that they'd carried out germ warfare against the communists. The U.S. vehemently denied that accusation. Other soldiers were considered brainwashed because they refused to return to the U.S. at all. Some soldiers were also recorded, quote, repeating communist propaganda. Clearly, the only explanation for this unpatriotic behavior would have to have been that the communists had created a method or medication to achieve mind control over their enemies. At least that's the narrative our government and news media decided to run with. The truth is, 23 American prisoners of war had decided not to return to the U.S. after the Korean War, though 2 of them soon changed their minds and came home. Each of these men had their own reasons for staying behind. But it sparked a nationwide debate among journalists, politicians, military officials, psychiatrists, and soldiers. Of those 21 non-repatriates, only 3 of them were black, but yet there was a lot of emphasis in these public discussions in the white American press on those 3 soldiers' race. Many publications stressed that there was a special effort made by the Chinese to woo black soldiers. See, these tricky communists had the nerve to inform black people that in their Marxist society, everyone was treated equally, regardless of the color of their skin. Of all the things to be offended by in communist China, this is what they chose to generate public outrage: talk of equality. Keep in mind, America was still segregated in 1953. Of the other 18 soldiers that decided communism was right for them, it was decided they'd been susceptible to the enemy's brainwashing due to various perceived weaknesses, such as alcoholism, STDs, low IQs, and being diseased, whatever that means. All but 2 of the soldiers did eventually return to the U.S. One soldier, who returned home in 1965, said he'd stayed behind in China because during his 2 years as a prisoner of war, he'd felt increasingly abandoned by America. One of the 3 black soldiers who returned to the U.S. in 1966 said he'd chosen to stay in China because of racial discrimination in the U.S. He's quoted as saying, "Brainwashed? The Chinese unbrainwashed me. The black man had his mind brainwashed long before the Korean War." On April 10, 1953, newly appointed and first civilian CIA director Allen Dulles delivered a compelling speech to a normally mundane gathering of Princeton alumni. Dulles told attendees, quote, "In the past few years we have become accustomed to hearing much about the battle for men's minds, the war of ideologies. I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in Soviet hands. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare." End quote. He went on to describe the, quote, "Soviet brain perversion techniques as effective but abhorrent and nefarious." He ranted about how this sort of non-consensual experiment, even on enemies, was antithetical to American values, as well as antithetical to what should be human values. So naturally, he wanted the U.S. to do it too. He stated, "We in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare." With that speech and many sensationalized news headlines, public paranoia about brainwashing and the new threat of brain warfare spread across the U.S. throughout the 1950s. Fear of Soviet mind control, irresistible hypnotic technologies, mad scientists, and conspiracies about foreign communist governments trying to infiltrate our freedoms became an American cultural norm, a paranoia that's still being cultivated and preyed upon to this day. The idea of brainwashing was also somewhat comforting to Americans, explaining why not everybody agreed to think like them. Clearly, those communist countries must have been brainwashing not only their enemies but their own people into holding anti-American ideas and ideologies. Anything that doesn't fit America's mold of freedom must be the product of mind control. 3 days after Dulles' fateful speech, he approved the launch of Project MK Ultra. This top-secret CIA experiment was categorized as being intended for the covert use of biological and chemical materials. Now, while the U.S. government was so obsessed with the threat of communism ruining democracy, just 4 months after the beginning of Project MKUltra, on August 19, 1953, they secretly executed Operation Ajax. This covert operation under CIA direction facilitated the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, in favor of strengthening the monarchical dictatorship of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. As usual, that was pretty much all about oil and profits, to ensure Western control over Iran's petroleum resources. Democracy be damned. The U.S. government didn't formally acknowledge their role in the coup until August of 2013, though it wasn't a well-hidden secret. Okay, now we'll get into Project MKUltra. The project's covert mind control experiments mainly centered around behavior modification techniques. These techniques consisted of hypnosis, polygraphs, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, electroshock therapy, radiation exposure, and a slew of drugs, toxins, and chemicals. Many of those experiments were quietly funded by the U.S. government at universities and research centers. Believe it or not, when MKUltra first started, people actually volunteered to participate in the program, which was created and run by a seemingly sadistic chemist and recreational folk dancer named Sidney Gottlieb. But the voluntary nature of the project didn't last long. Gottlieb soon felt that the experiments required a wider range of test subjects. That wider range consisted of many of the most vulnerable members of society: mentally impaired boys at a state school, sexual psychopaths at a state hospital, various other patients and prisoners, and even American soldiers. Some test subjects were coerced into participating in the experiments. Some didn't even realize they were participating. The CIA was especially fond of using prisoners as test subjects because many of them were willing to consent to pretty much anything in exchange for extra recreation time or less time on their prison sentences. Not that consent really seemed to matter. These experiments were also conducted in secret American prisons and detention centers in Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, among other locations. These countries were largely under American control at the time, so they didn't have to worry about legalities. CIA agents were reportedly capturing and imprisoning enemy agents and people they felt may be suspicious or otherwise expendable throughout Europe and Asia. They'd lock these people in cells and do all sorts of grotesque experiments on them, all the while bombarding them with questions to see if they'd broken down their prisoners' resistance. These experiments were also conducted on unwitting participants in Canada, under the direction of a renowned psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, who's been described as godlike. Part of Dr. Cameron's celebrated history in psychiatry included studying the origins and nature of Nazi culture during World War II and participating in the Nuremberg trials, giving Nazis psychiatric examinations and diagnoses. Cameron's inhumane experiments took place at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, supposedly between 1957 and 1961, though some believe Cameron's work actually ranged from about 1950 to 1965, and he may have even begun experimenting with drugs and electroshock on his own as early as the late 1940s. His known test subjects consisted of 53 psychiatric patients, mostly women, who were usually referred to Cameron by private physicians. They were forced to consume mega doses of LSD and subjected to electroshock therapy at 75 times the usual intensity. They were forced to listen to recorded messages on repeat for 16-hour intervals. This brainwashing technique was known as psychic driving. They were even put into induced comas. The patients didn't consent to these experiments and were never told they were being used for research. They were there simply for treatment for their mental illnesses, in many cases anxiety or depression. Canadian MKUltra test subjects, along with hundreds of their relatives, claimed the lasting effects of the experiments did irrevocable harm to their victims, tore families apart from divorce, removed children from their homes, placing them in foster care, and inflicted generational trauma. One pregnant test subject was tortured so severely, her medical records state that she was left incontinent, mute, had trouble swallowing, and had to relearn everything she'd previously known, leaving her with permanent memory loss and mental health challenges. When she'd experience issues related to her pregnancy, which included bleeding, they'd bring in an obstetrician to treat her, give her a few days to rest, then continue on with the experiment. This patient endured 29 documented extreme electroshock treatments during her pregnancy. Somehow she eventually gave birth to a live baby boy. He's still fighting for compensation today. Dr. Cameron's experiments were funded not only by the CIA, but also by the Canadian government. In fact, it's believed that the Canadian government continued to fund Cameron's twisted experiments for a while after the CIA stopped paying him. Project MKUltra was designed not to understand the human mind, but to completely destroy it and then reprogram it. But it only succeeded in the destruction. Many test subjects emerged completely broken, and others didn't even survive. As for Dr. Cameron, he died of a heart attack while mountain climbing in 1967 at the age of 66. MKUltra's experiments were essentially a continuation of the medical torture begun in Japanese and Nazi concentration camps. This isn't an exaggeration. Not only was it roughly based on those horrific experiments, but the CIA, America's Central Intelligence Agency, literally hired vivisectionists and torturers who'd worked in those concentration camps to come to the U.S. and fill them in on the information their experiments had yielded, so we could expand on them. Nazi doctors advised the CIA on experimentation with such drugs as mescaline and poisonous gases such as sarin, an extremely toxic nerve agent which is still being used today. The fact that the U.S. was willing to work with Nazi doctors in any capacity should probably be offensive to everybody, especially to help them develop torture techniques to use on their own people, or anybody really. And this was only 8 years after the end of World War II. Why were these people even allowed to exist at that point? But nevertheless, literal Nazis were invited to Fort Detrick in Maryland, which was the center of the MKUltra project, to tell the CIA how long it took for innocent people to die from being gassed with sarin. But the Soviets were consulting with Nazis, so of course we had to do the same. Obviously, the experiments that stemmed from that meeting violated multiple human rights. In the 1940s, the CIA became aware of the existence of a psychoactive drug called LSD, short for lysergic acid diethylamide, or simply known on the street as acid. Hypothesizing that this drug may be the key to controlling the human mind and creating a truth serum, CIA scientists involved with MKUltra became rather obsessed with it by the 1950s. In fact, MKUltra director Gottlieb is credited with being the man who brought LSD to America and basically starting the whole LSD counterculture that was to follow. In the late 1940s, the CIA received reports that the Soviets had attempted to buy the world's supply of LSD. According to the later testimony of one former CIA agent, the agency was, quote, literally terrified of the Soviets' LSD program, stating that was mostly due to the CIA's lack of knowledge about the drug. The CIA had, up until that point, not been able to locate or obtain the drug, and believed it, quote, had potential fantastic possibilities if used wrongly. And apparently they wanted to make sure they were the first to use it wrongly. Their imaginations ran wild with the possibilities of utilizing the drug for everything from controlling people's thoughts and actions to removing people from Europe in the case of a Soviet attack, and even facilitating assassinations of enemy leaders. CIA officials noted that LSD could potentially be useful in, quote, gaining control of bodies, whether they were willing or not. Keep in mind, science fiction was also quickly gaining popularity in America at around this time. In the early 1950s, Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to spend $240,000 to buy the world's entire known supply of LSD, because apparently they finally managed to figure out how to get it. On November 18, 1953, a group of 10 scientists met at a secluded cabin located deep in the woods of Maryland. There, they agreed that in order to truly understand the value of the drug, an unwitting experiment would be desirable. Once the LSD arrived in the U.S., Gottlieb distributed it to various hospitals, clinics, prisons, and other institutions that were designed to meet the basic needs of our most vulnerable citizens. He then lied to the directors of these institutions, using fraudulent foundations as a cover. He asked them to carry out research projects to find out what LSD was, how people reacted to it, and how it might be used to facilitate mind control. In many cases, the first volunteers of these experiments found taking LSD to be quite enjoyable. In many cases, these were actual willing volunteers. They even spread the word to their friends. Some of those early participants included Ken Casey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Robert Hunter, lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who became proponents of the recreational LSD counterculture. None of them realized they were guinea pigs in a secret CIA experiment. There is also a good argument that Charles Manson's family cult's infamous 1969 murder spree was the tragic result of Manson's alleged involvement in Project MKUltra. Another notable purported test subject was Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. It's certainly ironic that the CIA brought LSD to America in an attempt to master mind control, only to end up inadvertently fueling the rebellion of a generation that became a major thorn in their side. One of the prison inmates at an Atlanta, Georgia penitentiary who became an MKUltra test subject was the infamous mob boss Whitey Bulger. Bulger agreed to participate in 1957 after being misled to believe that the drug was thought to be a potential cure for schizophrenia. He was given LSD every day for more than a year. In reality, he was given LSD to find out how it would affect people long term. More specifically, they wanted to know if it would drive him insane. Bulger eventually figured this out, and later was quoted as describing the experience as 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares, and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. In the beginning, the CIA's experiments with LSD were pretty simple, though obviously unethical. They'd find volunteers and carry out their experiment, dosing them with the drug for however long they decided to keep it up. Over time, they also sometimes slipped the drug into the drinks of fellow CIA employees, with and without consent. But eventually, their experiments grew increasingly more elaborate. One particularly notorious example of this would be known as Operation Midnight Climax. In 1955, the CIA renovated and meticulously decorated a house in San Francisco, California, for the purpose of carrying out a truly bizarre experiment. The man in charge of this was George White, who'd had a long and storied career in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The CIA brought White on board when they decided to start experimenting with drugs. White painstakingly made sure every detail of the San Francisco house, and particularly one special bedroom, exuded sex and glamour. I guess that was just a bonus skill he brought to the agency. He then hired a Berkeley engineering student to bug the whole place with recording devices and install a two-way mirror in the bedroom. During these so-called experiments, White would be seated on the other side of the mirror completely unseen, sipping a martini, while sex workers would lure unsuspecting clients into the bedroom. They'd then dose the men with LSD while performing their usual services, while White observed. As payment for their services, the sex workers would receive small amounts of cash, along with a guarantee from White that he'd help them out with any future run-ins they may have with law enforcement. There were reportedly other houses like the one in San Francisco, though that one was apparently the most popular. The CIA claimed these so-called safe houses were merely for observing the effects of LSD. They also analyzed when, in the course of a sexual encounter, information could best be extracted from a source. After what was apparently copious amounts of observation, they concluded the answer to that is immediately after sex. White himself seemed to have ulterior motives, the most prevalent being voyeurism. He's later quoted as saying, quite creepily, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" MK Ultra supervisor Gottlieb was also a master of poisons, and came up with some rather disturbing ideas for possible assassination attempts and bizarre practical jokes. I'm really only adding this information because I find it bizarre and couldn't keep it to myself. In March of 1960, Gottlieb suggested spraying Cuban President Fidel Castro's television studio with LSD and saturating Castro's shoes with thallium to make his beard fall out. He also proposed schemes to assassinate Castro, including the use of a poisoned cigar, a poisoned wetsuit, an exploding conch shell, and a poisonous fountain pen. In the summer of 1960, Gottlieb traveled to the Congo with a vial of poison, with plans to place it on Congo Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba's toothbrush, but the CIA's Congo Station Chief Larry Devlin declined the assignment. Shortly afterward, a coup overthrew and killed Lumumba in 1961. But this really makes you wonder how many people the CIA has actually successfully murdered and kept quiet. Gottlieb and his team operated almost completely without supervision. His boss, Richard Helms, and the CIA director, Allen Dulles, seemingly signed off on whatever he was doing without really wanting to actually know what he was doing. He never really had to file reports or answer to anybody. It seems that the end goal, to master mind control and possibly achieve global world power, was so important to the CIA that he was basically given a blank check. But yet the agency clearly knew the project was questionable at best. They knew the public's reaction to Project MKUltra wouldn't be favorable. How would they explain away dosing unwitting Americans with LSD, or any of the countless other atrocities they'd committed against unwilling participants? They did their damnedest to hide Project MKUltra from the public. In 1957, the CIA's Inspector General wrote, "Precautions must be taken, not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general." The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission. In June of 1972, the American government was rocked by a discovery made as a result of a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel and Office Building in Washington, D.C., and the subsequent attempted cover-up of his involvement by then-President Richard Nixon. Nixon resigned in shame on August 9, 1974. 69 people were indicted, and 48 people, many of them top Nixon administration officials, were convicted. Though not entirely historically accurate, I recommend watching the movie Dick for more context. Anyway, this is actually relevant to Project MKUltra, believe it or not. Project MKUltra ended rather anticlimactically in 1973, when then CIA Director Richard Helms was suddenly asked by Nixon for his resignation, for unclear reasons, though Helms was adamant it was due to his refusal to participate in the Watergate cover-up. But he was perfectly willing to participate in the MKUltra cover-up. Fearing a Watergate-style situation within the CIA, Helms and Gottlieb, knowing it was just a matter of time before he was fired too, attempted to destroy all MKUltra-related files. Helms was said to be the only person within the organization who truly knew what Gottlieb had been doing. Gottlieb even personally drove out to the CIA Records Center and ordered the archives to destroy boxes full of MKUltra records. In later testimony, it came out that 10 years earlier, the spring of 1963, John Vance, a member of the CIA Inspector General's staff, had actually learned about the project's, quote, surreptitious administration to unwitting, non-voluntary human subjects, and the CIA's Independent Audit Board convened to discuss the matter. The Inspector General decided the agency needed to follow new research ethics guidelines and bring all the programs on non-consenting volunteers to an end. Was this seriously not a rule before? So how do we now know all of this about such a secretive government project? It was brought to the public's attention in 1975 when declassified CIA documents began leaking, and a journalist's Freedom of Information Act request made those documents public. It turns out there were some records that Gottlieb was unable to destroy. For instance, there was a depot for expense account reports and various other financial documents that managed to survive. That was enough to reconstruct some of the details of Project MKUltra, though Gottlieb's efforts to erase all traces of its existence were nearly successful. There were also witnesses, government agents and civilians involved in the project. While Richard Helms also ordered that all documents concerning Dr. Cameron's Montreal MKUltra experiments be destroyed in 1973, apparently that didn't happen. The documents that had survived were released by the Freedom of Information Act in 1977. In August of 1977, congressional hearings were held investigating the breadth, scope, and effects of Project MKUltra. Congress questioned quite a few ex-CIA employees but hit a lot of roadblocks. One big one was that the CIA staffers repeatedly claimed they couldn't remember details about the human experimentation or the number of test subjects. Another huge hindrance was the lack of documentation, since most of it had been destroyed. The CIA's reasoning for attempting to destroy all evidence of MKUltra's existence was something lame about protecting the privacy of participants and preventing embarrassment. So now they care about their test subjects? One of quite a few disturbing details that did come out during the hearings was that in 1953, Dr. Frank Olson, an Army biological warfare scientist, had unknowingly had his drink spiked with LSD, as the CIA agents involved in the experiments were in the habit of doing to their coworkers. The person who put the LSD in Dr. Olson's drink was said to be none other than Allen Dulles, the man who effectively started this whole MKUltra mess and contributed greatly to the American public's Cold War paranoia. Several days later, after being hospitalized, Dr. Olson supposedly jumped to his death through a closed 10-story hotel window at the age of 43. I say he supposedly jumped because a second autopsy revealed evidence that he may actually have been pushed. He was one of only about 24 men who knew the true nature of Project MKUltra and reportedly knew the CIA's darkest secrets. Another known death as a result of Project MKUltra was that of professional tennis player Harold Blower. The congressional hearings also took place at an interesting time amid the increasing criminalization of drug users. This was just a few years after Nixon declared drug abuse as public enemy number one, and then the public finds out the CIA was probably one of the biggest culprits in getting drugs into the hands of the American people. Prior to LSD, the CIA had also experimented with THC, cocaine, heroin, and mescaline. Since the truth about Project MKUltra became public knowledge, intelligence experiments of the same nature have finally been outlawed, though it's pretty unlikely the CIA's terminated all experimental drug testing programs. Later evidence has even suggested the project carried on under a different name. In the end, after all of that effort and innocent lives lost or permanently altered, Gottlieb concluded that mind control is impossible. We'll never know how many people died or how many lives were destroyed by Project MKUltra. But we do know what happened to Sidney Gottlieb. He retired from the CIA in 1973 at the end of Project MKUltra. Well, that's what they say. I did find one report that claimed he went on to lead a CIA program that created poisons and spy equipment. Since he'd done that for quite a while before and during MKUltra, it really wouldn't surprise me. But the official story is that Gottlieb retired and focused on his family life with his wife and their 4 kids, 2 sons and 2 daughters, in an ecologically correct home in Culpeper, Virginia. There, he reportedly raised goats, ate yogurt, and advocated peace and environmentalism. He and his wife Margaret also traveled around Australia, Africa, and India for 2 years, then ran a leper hospital in India. He was never convicted of any crimes. Gottlieb died at his Virginia home on March 7, 1999, at the age of 81, of unspecified natural causes, though he'd had a bad heart for quite some time. While considered a very compassionate person by many, Sidney Gottlieb was clearly one of the most prolific torturers of his generation. As for the CIA, they went from the Cold War to the War on Terror, and were right back to their old sadistic tactics. For instance, after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, they rounded up hundreds of captives, imprisoning them at the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, as well as a network of secret prisons around the world known as black sites. When traditional interrogation techniques didn't yield the information the CIA wanted, they resorted to torture, euphemistically named enhanced interrogation techniques. These techniques included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, confinement boxes, shackling, and exposing detainees to extreme temperatures, sounds, and pain. At least 118 detainees were subjected to this type of tortured interrogation. CIA training manuals reportedly still include inhumane interrogation tactics employed during Gottlieb's MKUltra experiments and Cameron's depraved work in Montreal. In 1997, a Baltimore Sun investigation revealed that Honduran military forces accused of kidnapping, torture, and murder had been trained by the CIA and studied the CIA's training manual. But there's no proof that prolonged torture even works to produce truthful, valid information. In fact, all scientific evidence points to the contrary. Sure, it'll get people to talk, but those victims usually just say whatever they feel they need to say to stop it. In fact, we've known this since at least as far back as the witch trials of the 1600s. And anyone in support of the CIA's enhanced interrogation tactics should probably brush up on the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. So while Project MKUltra didn't give anyone powers of telekinesis like Eleven and Stranger Things, it did leave an awful lot of people in a similar state to her mother. And knowing more about this covert government experiment makes the premise of Stranger Things uncomfortably more believable. Imagine all of the experiments we don't know about. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this topic and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have an opinion, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.